evening. My name is Dana Treichler. I'm an adult services librarian here at Princeton Public Library, and it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's author event with Robert Durkee of a new Princeton Companion. Joining him in conversation tonight is Jill Dolan, Dean of the College and a non-professor in English and Professor of Theater at Princeton University. I want to start by thanking you all for joining us, both in person and via our YouTube live stream. I also want to thank Princeton University Press and Labyrinth Books for being our partners in the event today. Tonight's program is going to run about 60 minutes in total. For those of you in the community room, there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the event. Additionally, Labyrinth Books is on site selling copies, and Bob will be signing at the end if you're interested. Lastly, I'd like to mention that the room is T-Coil enabled. So if you have a T-Coil enabled device, feel free to to switch them on now. If you don't, we do have headsets in the back of the room if you would like one. It's now my pleasure to introduce Bob Durkee and Jill Dolan.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming out tonight on a day when it's been threatening heavy rain and tornadoes for the duration. I hope we don't suffer any of those while we're talking, but thank you for being here. I'm really delighted to be here speaking with my friend and former colleague, Bob Durkee. We worked together at Princeton since I became Dean of the college in 2015 until Bob retired in, was it 18 or until 19, just before the pandemic.
Those are unrelated.
Those are unrelated, yes. He did not wish the pandemic on the campus, but there we are. It's always a pleasure to be in conversation with Bob. I think, especially since both of us really appreciate a good written word and a well-edited thought. So I am delighted to be here to talk with Bob about the new Princeton Companion, which is, first of all, a beautiful book and a hefty book and a really important book, especially for those of us who care about Princeton University, and I think there's a number of you in the audience. So Bob, I thought we could first start by just talking about an overview of how the book was conceived and shaped, and also where did the genesis for the idea come from? Did the press approach you and say, this book, which Bob has brought, we have props up here, the original version of the Companion could use an update, or was it the other way around?
Well, first let me say I'm also delighted that everyone who is here, and those on YouTube, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. There are people in this room who go back to those early days of the conception of this book. That book, the former one, which press published in 1978, sat in my office in Nassau Hall from the day it came out until the day I left Nassau Hall. And I used it frequently, and one of the small ironies of this whole history is Alec Leach, the author of that book, commissioned various people to write entries in that book. And one of the people he commissioned was me. So I actually have an entry in that book.
Which entry did you write in the original?
I wrote about the so-called Council of the Princeton University Community, the CPUC. So a number of efforts were begun but aborted over the years to create an updated companion. And then I think it's true that when the press realized I was about to retire, and thinking I might be a reasonably decent person to bring out a new version, did come to me. And you talk about the girth of the book. I actually went back and looked at the agreement I have with the press to produce this book. And Peter, I don't know if you remember this. This book is, I think, 584 pages. The contract calls for a book of 704. So it's not as heavy as it could be. Although it has more words in it than were originally intended. But it was really the press coming to me and my thinking, this would be a wonderful opportunity. I've used this book so much, and I'd be delighted to have a chance to create a version that I hope many generations of Princetonians and others will enjoy after me.
Excellent. And we should say that Peter Doherty, the editor of the book and of the series in which it's published at Princeton University Press, is with us tonight. Thank you, Peter, for being here and for your work on the book. So what struck me as I was reading it, and also this is a reference book that's going to be really useful for, I think, anyone who works at Princeton, wants to think about Princeton or write about Princeton, is in a way, it's kind of a canon. It's a list of things that one should know about Princeton. And as someone who has taught literature and theater for many years, you realize that any list is by nature exclusive because there's always something left off. So Bob in the book says, he admits that the book is full of what he calls commissions and omissions of necessity, because you only had 704 words and you only used 564 of them. So I guess my question for you is, what do you think, how do you take responsibility for what's in the book and what's left out of the book?
Well, let me go back and say that I think in some ways the most interesting part of this process was the very beginning of deciding what's in and what's not, right? So Alec had about 400 entries in his book. I use 280, some, more or less, of his. But none of his are used exactly as they were in the initial book. Some of them had to be updated, some of them had to be fixed to take into account of things we know now and didn't know then. But there is no entry that came over exactly as it was. But then there are 115 new entries. And the interesting part of this process was trying to figure out what goes out, what stays in, what gets recombined in different ways. Always with the idea that what we wanted to do was not only capture the fact that Princeton University was now 50 years further along, but had changed in very significant ways. And we wanted to capture that in what we decided to include and in what we decided to exclude. I want to talk just a little bit about how we did that, right? In fact, the original outline for the book anticipated 445 entries. We ended up with 404. So there was some evolution over time. And what we did in the beginning, and I give the press all the credit for this, they sent it out to a set of reviewers who represented perspectives on Princeton that reflected the last 50 years, and particularly the evolution in terms of diversity and inclusion. And they looked at what they looked at was what I was proposing to include and exclude. And I give them a lot of credit for coming back and basically saying to me, you're going in the right direction, you're not going far enough. You can go further. There are more people you can put in there than you already have on your list. And one example was Sally Frank. I mean, Sally Frank had an important, was a very important figure in the evolution of Princeton over these 50 years. And I've known and admired Sally for a long time. I didn't have her on my list. They said, Sally should be on your list. Tracy K. Smith was another example of someone who, I knew about, but they said, Tracy K. Smith really belongs on your list. On the other side, they said, you've got some people in there who maybe, if you want a better balance, you might want to exclude them. And they tended to be alumni. Sorry about that. They were alumni who had made significant contributions to the world. But of course, lots and lots and lots of alumni have made significant contributions to the world. And so it got me thinking about what criterion I was going to use for deciding which alumni to include and which not. And in the end, I decided that I would only include alumni if either they had had a significant impact on Princeton or they were part of the founding of the country. And that had the effect of removing about 15 names. And what those 15 names had in common was they were all white men. Right? So it affected the balance of the book, I think, in a very productive way. Now, I got myself into a bit of a problem there because I had a couple of people I really wanted to include that I wasn't able to fit under that criteria. So I found a way, for example, to get Adlai Stevenson in the book. If you read the entry on Stevenson Hall, it's about 10% on Stevenson Hall, and about 90% on Adlai Stevenson, right? And I did make one exception. I thought I had to have Norman Thomas in there, and so I did put Norman Thomas in there, even though he didn't quite fit the criteria. So that was the first round of review. Then there was a second round of review, and it's the editorial board of the press, Peter, is that what it's called? And they saw the list of what I had proposed to include and exclude, and I was very pleased. They came back and they had, among them, I don't know how many of them there were, but among them, they had exactly one suggestion of someone I had taken out that they thought should be included. And it's actually a man by the name of Basil Gildersleeve. And he was a very prominent humanist in the 19th century, and I hadn't appreciated how significant he was. But he's also an interesting story in two other ways. He was a devout Southerner, disaffected from the university for many years because of the positions it took during the Civil War. And he had a son who actually was an architect who designed a number of Princeton's buildings. So it was good to have him in the book, and I hadn't appreciated that, and I appreciated that suggestion.
That's interesting. It struck me when I read your acknowledgments that the book is rather collaborative, but hearing how the review process works and the kind of advice you were getting is interesting. At the same time, it seems to me, any book, of course, is imprinted by the values and personality and commitments of the person who writes or edits it. So this is not just an institutional project that you've created for us here, but a personal project. So I wonder if you could say a bit about how your 47 years at Princeton influenced, in conjunction with the readers and the editors, some of the choices that you made about the writing, about the editing. If I had done this book, it might be very different. The fact that Bob Durkee, with his many years at Princeton, the fact that you're an alum, contributes, I'm sure, to your perspective and your choices.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think any book, on the one hand, you don't want it to be too idiosyncratic, right? On the other hand, you can't help but be influenced by your own experiences. And, two of my important early experiences at Princeton came as an undergraduate, right? I'm a classmate here today, Rich Ryan. Rich was the chair of the Prince. I was the editor-in-chief of the Prince in my senior year. But as a reporter, I broke the story that Princeton was going to become coeducational. And I wrote the first major story about the experience of black students at Princeton. So I had interests in, coeducation and in diversity going back to my undergraduate years. And I think that did. Now, who knew when I was writing about coeducation that I would end up with 3 daughters at Princeton, one of whom is here tonight, class of 96. Hello, Sharon. So that's part of the answer to your question. Part of the answer to your question is I had all these materials that no one else had, right? So there are two stories in the book that I'm particularly happy to have in there. One is in the article about Bob Goheen. So there's a wonderful story in there about the trustees going to Dean Rusk, who then was the head of the Rockefeller Foundation, later became U.S. Secretary of State. And they asked Rusk about Goheen. And Rusk says, and I won't get the quote exactly right, but it's more or less, if I'm in a jungle somewhere surrounded by the enemy, and I could only have one person in the world with me, it would be Bob Goheen, right? Now, how do I know that? I know that because a couple of student interns in my office in the 1970s had done an oral history with Harold Helm, who had been on the search committee, who told this story about Dean Rusk, right? So here, that story's not even in the archives, right? The other one has to do with Jack Kennedy, right? So Jack Kennedy is Princeton class of 39. He's only here for a semester. But Alec wrote a little piece about him in his book. And he gets a letter afterwards from an alum. The alums in the room will know this name, Bud Wynn, class of 39, who says, well, you left something out. Jack was my classmate, and I want to tell you that, later in life, I had a conversation with Jack about, Jack, what do you do when you go to a Harvard-Princeton football game? And Kennedy said, I root for Harvard, but I pray for Princeton. Right? And again, I mean, these are the kinds of stories that wouldn't be in the book if I hadn't written the book, because they come out of my files. I got to get these things off to the archives.
I was going to say, are they going to the archives?
Yeah, they'll go to the archives. I'm going to mention just one other thing. There's the opening of the entry on student publications. Has a nice little vignette about Harold Shapiro at the end of his first year in office, talking about the fact that what really struck him about Princeton was how much Princeton students and alumni like to write. Well, that comes from a conversation he and I had, one day at the end of his first year. The piece about Stan Kelly, who was a transformative figure, created the CPUC, introduced the idea of young alumni trustees, did many important things at Princeton. Stan was my thesis advisor, right? And so there are all these kinds of connections. I'll tell you one other thing. When I was working on the book in the beginning days, there was an outside organization that was sort of helping compile the information. I would send them these lists of what I was proposing to include. And one day the guy writes back to me and says, "Are you sure you want to have an entry called Nude Olympics?" And I said to him, anyone who has been at Princeton over that era knows that you can't tell the story of Princeton in that era without talking about the Nude Olympics, right? I'm not sure someone outside would know that as much as I did because I was inside. But these are examples, I think, of things that were different because I was the person doing the book.
I think it's part of the pleasure of the book, in fact, is that you do have that inside knowledge. I have to say, even now in the Office of the Dean of the College, when we have a question about what, for instance, recently we thought about, why are majors at Princeton called concentrations? I'm sure there's a history to that. And my first thought was, we got to ask Bob Durkee, but I have the new edition here, and I got to look it up first. So between the archive and yourself and the book, we know where to go when we have these questions. So one of the things that struck me about reading the new companion, there's 3 essays that frame the book. And it's clear from reading those essays how much of recent history has influenced how you think about telling the history of Princeton, how you think about telling the history of service at Princeton. It seems that these essays are really significantly shaped by what we call on campus, in fact, the racial reckoning, especially the campus events of 2015 and 16, and then the summer of 2020 and beyond. And I think you call it in the book the kind of unsaid of Princeton's history. So I'm wondering, one, how that framing was useful to you in telling this story now, and 2, if that was unsaid in the first version of the book, what do you think might be unsaid still in the latest version of the book?
360,000 words, and she wants to know what was unsaid.
Well, there's always something that's not.
There's always something, that's true. So again, I want to give Peter credit. When we started this project, we knew we were going to pick up the idea of encyclopedia-type entries, right? Just the way Alec had done. But that was all he did. And it was really Peter who said, I think opening with some framing essays would be a good idea. And I think Peter had the idea that one of them should be a kind of overarching history. The others were kind of up to me to figure out. And, everyone is interested in the evolution of the campus, physical campus. There is an entry in the book on the campus, but I thought it would be fun to have John Lafter, longtime university architect, work with me on drawing some maps to actually show the evolution. And then, of course, talking about the manifestations of the motto, the nation's service and now the service of humanity, also seemed to make sense. We also did some other things that aren't in the other book, all these lists. And maybe we'll talk in a minute about the calendar, but that was another thing. So I've thought a little bit about if I got to do another version now, what would I go into? And there are actually two other longer essays that I think I would like to do. One is about the role and impact of alumni. Now that may seem an odd thing to say, but there is an entry on the Alumni Council. There are entries on, talk about alumni involved in other ways. But I didn't really pull it together and really reflect on, the important role alumni played in the 19th century, in converting Princeton from a more clerical institution to a more secular institution, and the role alumni continue to play over time. I was struck the other day, someone asked me about the origins of the schools committees. And I realized that in the book, I don't really go back and talk about the origins. I talk about the fact that the schools committees are alumni who interview students and encourage them to come to Princeton. And it actually turns out to be interesting. If you go back to the first sort of, they begin around the turn of the 20th century. And for about the first 40 years, the actual official name of the schools committees is the Committee on Proprietary Schools. Because what alumni are doing there is trying to make connections with proprietary schools. With a few exceptions, in the regional associations, some of the alumni are trying to get local kids to come to Princeton. And then after World War II, it changes into what it is now. But I think taking a larger, more integrated look at alumni would be important. The other, in your realm, has to do with academics. So there are entries on all of the departments. There are entries on a number of the institutes and centers and so on and so forth. There's an entry on the academic program. But I think maybe, and there are entries, the entry on Veblen talks about his role in bringing scholars from Europe around World War II. And the entry on Marquand talks about the incredible impact he had on teaching art in this country in its early days of teaching art, or the religion department being the first sort of academic religion department. There are pieces of the story. But I'm not sure I did as much as I could have done to pull the whole story together of Princeton's impact on the world of academia over the course of its history. So those are areas where I think I'd be. Now, I have one other answer to your question, something I realized too late to put into the book. And this goes back, and I think my colleague Joyce in the Washington office is watching, so I can't remember if this is during Joyce's year or a little earlier. Congress at one point was proposing to pass a law that would impose serious constraints on any piece of land at any university that had been designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. And someone in Congress had heard that Princeton had Olmsted designed land. Well, I didn't know that, and I decided to do a little research to see whether that was true or not. It turns out it's not true. And there's this one, and I wish I had put this in the entry on the campus, there's a wonderful statement in trustee minutes from the secretary of the board reporting that he had been in touch with Olmsted about doing some work for Princeton. Olmsted had done some preliminary work for Princeton. And he writes this wonderful letter back where he says, first of all, you didn't do and third, we're not going to. So again, that's a story I wish I had been able to do, but I just forgot it too late.
That's fabulous. I love the idea of doing framing essays about alums and about the academic, or the influence Princeton's had on academics. I was fascinated by the entry on the program of study, how it came to be over the years, how it's changed. But Princeton obviously has had a great deal of influence on the status of knowledge and the academy and the world. That would be very interesting. But then you'd have to write about faculty, too. Did you have rules about writing about faculty in the same way you had about alums?
Yes. Yes. So, and I, on a number of these areas, I was very fortunate. I had a very helpful early conversation about the book with David Dobkin. I had a number of
former dean of the faculty.
Former dean of the faculty. I had a very helpful conversation with Sanish Kulkarni, later dean of the faculty, and his staff, in trying to figure out more, which programs and centers I needed to focus on and which ones I didn't, which awards I needed to include. Alex's book only has Nobels. This has all kinds of awards, and I had a very long session one day with David trying to figure out which ones do you have to put in. I can't put in everyone. How do you do this? In terms of the faculty, what I ended up deciding was if the faculty member's impact was essentially an impact on their field, then I would cover that in the entry on their department or their field. And that the faculty members who would get their own entries would be ones whose impact really went beyond their own field. Somehow they had an impact, and particularly on the diversification of Princeton. When I talk in the preface about people I left out, would like not to have left out, there's a long list of faculty I would love to have been able to include. But I did have to make some decisions, and it was really about people who had helped convert Princeton from the university it was to the university it is, and not just through the work in the field.
That makes sense. I have two more questions, and then we'll open it up for your questions, and we're competing with the rain on the roof of it now, which has finally arrived. So my question is about, and I encourage you all to look at the maps that are in the book. They show in a beautiful way the evolution of the physical campus up until 2046, which is as far as the current campus plan goes. So the maps give you a really good idea of what the campus did look like, what it will look like. It also begs the question for me of what will life on campus look like in 2046? In terms of the student experience, especially, how will the changing physical space change the student experience on campus? And questions like, this book is not predictive, but I'm asking you as author, do you think that Princeton will ever change dramatically? It's a pretty big change to the footprint, but what about things like the size of the student body or the eating clubs or some of the distinctive features of what it means to be a Princetonian? You have any prognostications here?
I should turn around and ask you, Jill, because you're
no, your experience here is still longer than mine.
Yeah, but not as current. So let me say a couple of things. I do, in the opening essay, try to take the story through to 2046 and suggest a few things. I think the first thing I will say, Alex's book came out in 1978. I don't think any of us at that time anticipated residential colleges. And residential colleges were in place 5 years later and thoroughly transformed the nature of the undergraduate experience. So anyone making predictions has to recognize that something very similar could be happening now. The other thing that there are a lot of things about the book that I find really fascinating, but one is this whole idea of how the campus expanded in size, right? As late as like 1896, Princeton's campus was 50 acres, right? And all of a sudden, within about 10 years, it has 500 plus acres because it gets 4 farms that take it all the way down to the lake. And then it gets the lake, which is 400 acres. And then it gets the Gray Farm, which is another 100 acres. And then in the 1920s and 1940s, it gets 400, 500 more acres in West Windsor, right? So the land is there. The reason I make that point is the land is there if there's something Princeton wants to do that requires land. I do tell the story in the book about Princeton's law school, right? And the 7 graduates of the Princeton Law School who are in the annals of Princeton history. And I talk about the fact that when Bill Bowen was president, he commissioned the study of whether Princeton should have a law school. You know that the trustees in their recent strategic planning discussions, again, took a careful look at whether Princeton, should be thinking about professional schools. And I think in this generation, probably more a business school than a law school or a medical school. I don't think I've been in a conversation with a group of 10 or more alumni over the last few years where there isn't somebody in the room who wants to make a case for professional schools at Princeton. On the other hand, Princeton has made this decision over its history that it's going to focus on PhD programs. It's going to emphasize undergraduate education. It's going to remain cohesive. And it's hard to see how you do all those things and add a lot of other professional schools. So, but what I say in the essay is, clearly technology is going to affect things. Probably climate change is going to affect things. And, one of the entries that got added to this book somewhere along the way is the entry on epidemics. Yeah. Right? And so, how is that going to affect things? You've lived the experience of the last few years of trying to cope with this. What comes out of that the university tries to sustain? One of the things I say in the book is there's this interesting project that I think the provost is now overseeing to look at whether it's time for Princeton to provide academic potentially degree granting experiences for non-resident students. Well, that would be a huge change in Princeton's history. It's being studied. 5 years from now, will that be the equivalent of residential colleges for the first? I don't know. But I think there are some interesting questions, and I don't have the answers to them.
Yes, but I think those are really interesting predictions myself. Let me ask my last question, and then we'll turn to your questions, which is about the calendar. This is distinct in this version of the companion, and it raised. It's a beautiful display of 366
yes.
entries in the calendar, and it's also illustrated with various photos, which I also had questions about, just simply how you curated the photos. What did you choose to represent and what not? But about the calendar, I wondered how you assembled it. Did the events come first and then you plug them in today? What was that process of decision making like?
So what I've been doing when I give talks about the book is I usually start by going to the calendar. So today's entry in the calendar is actually from last year, which is the fact that the commencement took place on this day last year in the stadium. Now, I thought that was significant because it was the first post-pandemic commencement. This year's commencement is going to be in the stadium too. Exactly. And maybe next year's. And maybe the ones after that. And I'm not asking you to make a prediction. But I may have been onto something a little bit more than just a one-time.
See, I said you were prescient.
Experience. Yesterday, if you go into the calendar, was the day that back in 1963, that the letters went out to the first group of critical language students, which included the first women students to be enrolled at Princeton. And tomorrow is the day in 1939 when Princeton was on the first ever televised baseball game with Columbia. So I say that to say I like the calendar, I enjoy the calendar. It started with the dates. No, it didn't. It started with 1996. At the time of the bicentennial, and there aren't a lot of people in this room who can say that, but when we were celebrating the 250th, the communications office did a calendar. It didn't have something for every day. It probably had maybe 25% of the days had something on them. I learned doing this that not all of them were accurate. But I had helped oversee that. And so I knew that the calendar, and we'd send it out to all alumni. And alumni had enjoyed it. So I figured, well, this is going to be fun. Let's see if we can, so I start with the dates. Let's pick up ones from the old calendar. As I was going through the book, if I would come upon a date of something, I worked with a woman named Helene van Rossen, who had been in the archives, who just was very into this. And we really worked hard to try to find something for every day. And at one point we figured out a little bit of a trick. Because it turns out in Princeton history that there are days when 14 things important happened, and days when nothing important happened, right? And it wasn't just important stuff. We wanted some fun stuff and so on and so forth. But anyway, we figured out that if there were 2 things that happened on a given day, on that day, we could report that event. And on the next day, we could say, the prince reported that. On the day before, this happened, right? August was a challenge. August
wasn't publishing.
Well, the prince wasn't publishing, and not much was happening in August. And in fact, I got so desperate at one point that one of the, I think, interesting organizations that came out of the upheavals of the late 1960s was this group called the Movement for a New Congress. So there's an entry in the book about the Movement for a New Congress. And it was an effort to engage, it was a Stan Kelly idea, and it was an effort to engage undergraduates around the country in becoming involved in congressional campaigns. If you wanted a new Congress, you went out and you got new people elected. Turns out, I hadn't realized this myself, that there seems to have been only one congressional race in 1970 where the volunteers from a Movement for a New Congress actually made a difference. And that was the first congressional race by Paul Sarbanes. And they probably got him elected. And of course, he went on to play, many significant roles at Princeton and in the country. But anyway, the Movement for a New Congress, the Today Show was interested in the Movement for a New Congress. And so they actually asked 2 people from Princeton to come on the Today Show and talk about it in August. And I was one of them, so I knew the date.
That's fabulous. And what about the photos?
Oh, the photos. So, in the agreement, it calls for the Alex book essentially has no photos. It was proposed that we have up to 50. And then once we got into the calendar and realized it would be much more interesting if we could illustrate it fully as we did, the number of photos in the book, I think, about doubled. But not everything is in the calendar. And so what we tried to do with the photos was drive home this point about diversity and inclusion. So where do the photos mostly appear? In the entry on alumni affinity conferences and in the entry on the portrait collection, the diversification of the portrait collection. So it was a way to illustrate that change in Princeton, not just through words, but through pictures.
That's great. Thank you for this. Let's open it to your questions. We have mic runners who will come around simply so that people in the room can hear you and also people on the live stream can hear you as you ask. Anyone want to start us out? Yes, Henry.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to say, Bob, this is a real gift to Princeton. I mean, it's going to have a staying power, and it's going to be something that many of us look at for years to come. So thank you. You're getting a lot of feedback now, presumably, about things that that people would like to see in the book, or you've talked about a couple of essays that you would like to have seen in the book. You and I have talked about the fact that there's always a typo or two. My question is whether you've considered either an addendum while you have this current knowledge, or a reprint in a couple of years that includes some of the things. Because, I mean, honestly, this is the time, if you're going to add things, this is the time to do it while you have the knowledge.
Henry, thank you. Jill was, before we started, looking through my old Princeton Companion and noting that it had no markings in it, but my new one actually has markings of all of the typos that I have found, including one just today. So I'm distressed by them. Most of them are not important, but I have talked before. I think it was in the TAP article that Rich and Pam did. I mean, talk about mistakes you should not make. So I got everything right in the article about Shirley Tillman's presidency. But if you look at the listing of presidents and the article on the presidents, I've got Shirley taking office the wrong year. So I subtracted 3 years from her and gave 3 years to Harold. So, you know, these are annoying. What's actually more, in terms of your question, more than that is, you know, there was a deadline here. And I mean, some of you know the story about, you know, the things that were happening as I was approaching deadline. I mean, one of the discoveries I made in the summer of 21, I guess, as we were, you know, moving close to closure here, was I had probably 6 or 7 references in the book to Perelman College.
Of course.
Now, Perelman College, for those of you in the room who know this, was a name attached to one of the new residential colleges being built and is no longer attached. But I had to go, and I was glad I was able to go through and remove those references, because I kept thinking of the poor reader, you know, years from now, coming to campus looking for college and wondering what's wrong with this book. You know, there is no Perelman College. But there were other things that were happening. I was trying to keep up to date with the Olympics. And then the most challenging in the end was the Nobel Prizes, right? So it's October. I've got an entry on Nobel Prizes. I point out in that entry that there was a year, 1993, when there were 3 Princeton Nobels. And now all of a sudden we get one. And then we get 2. And I'm trying to figure out, okay, then we get 3. Yeah. So now I've got a problem. I've got another example of 3. I've got David Macmillan, who's not only got to be on that list, but I've got to put something in the chemistry one, and I've got the same problem in astrophysics, and then talking to Peter about, you know, should we just wait a little longer? I know we're not going to get more than 3, but let's just see. And Peter, the former economics editor at the press, is saying, so then we get 2 more. So now we have 5. So they are all recognized in the book, but here's the problem. We were literally days from going on press, and the Nobel list is a list. You can't add a name by subtracting a name, right? So fortunately, there's a little paragraph at the beginning of that page where I could do some editing to get a footnote in about the book. So I got them in. But since then, we had an exchange today, Christy, the director of the press, with a alumna about the entry on Native American and indigenous students, pointing out how much has happened since we went to press. I've had people come forward with other things saying, you know, how about this? I was doing the article on the Princeton Alumni Weekly, which I've been, you know, attached to since I wrote for it as an undergraduate. And literally about a week or 2 after we went to press, they announced their new, you know, arrangement for publication. So these are the kinds of things, some of them smallish, that I would love to be able to fix. But I think it's going to be a while before there's a new edition. The press did. The book is available electronically, and they did fix the Shirley reference in that book, in that version. So I would love to be able to bring something out, Henry, but I don't know when and how, and that's something I'll keep talking with the press about.
Thanks for the question. Other questions? Yes. Here comes your mic.
Thank you. I'm Peter Kurtz, class of '64, and my question is really triggered by questions that I'm asked when I interview people who are applying for undergraduate study at Princeton, and especially those who are from a foreign country. And if I'm doing an interview in a foreign country because I just happen to be living there. So that's part of the reason it's triggered, and part of it is our first meeting in Rio de Janeiro, which was sort of a partial outcome of that question that I'm about to ask you. At some point, I believe, Princeton was struggling with, maybe a few decades ago, struggling with the idea of what to do, basically to earn that in the all nations service, addendum, right? And one thing that was considered apparently was to actually have sister campuses, brother locations, like so many other universities and colleges have done. And my understanding is that there's a lot of time spent on it, and a lot of studying was involved in, and ultimately Princeton decided to do exactly why you were in Rio that particular day with Sir Dickman, basically signing the agreement with the University of São Paulo, when it's actually out in São Paulo. And as a result, I started looking into it, and I believe that Princeton ultimately decided we're not going to have satellite campuses. There'll be one campus. We located on these acres and acres and hundreds of acres of land, and that's what we're doing now. And that's why we have these special relationships, academic primary, with what, four or five universities, maybe? I don't know. Can you add to that? The question is, has this decision been made, and what is it basically?
Let me just repeat the question in case people online didn't hear it necessarily. The question is, why is the decision made for Princeton to have satellite campuses, not to have satellite campuses, and instead to have agreements with other universities?
And what is it?
And what is the agreement?
So I'm gonna digress a little bit, and then I'll come back to your answer. One of the pieces in the book that probably wouldn't be there if it wasn't my book has to do with the role that Princeton played in creating the Kanpur Institute in India back in the 60s. There was a Princeton faculty member who played a key role, and Princeton faculty were on site for several years creating what is now, I think, the premier technical institute in India. One of my early assignments for Princeton was to travel to China in 1981, very early after opening China to the West, to sign agreements with Beijing University and Fudan University in Shanghai as a way of providing them as universities. I actually got a note a couple of years ago from Vince Poore, who was then the dean of the engineering school, asking me if I knew what this person from China was talking about when he wrote him about this agreement that existed between Princeton and Beida. And yes, so I did. So anyway, there are things in the book. I think the entry on international initiatives talks a lot about what you're talking about, that is, the agreements that have been made with different institutions at different levels. Some of them are more fulsome agreements, some of them less so. But that has been Princeton's model. There's also an entry on Impala, which is a wonderful opportunity for students to study, on site in Africa. But you're right. At one point, discussions were had about whether to have satellite campuses, and I could be wrong, but I think almost every university that has done that has either regretted it or stopped doing it. And I think what Princeton was saying at the time is it's just too hard to make sure that the quality of education at a site like that is going to be the quality of a Princeton education. We would rather put our emphasis on creating these agreements, research agreements, back and forth, scholarly activity, and trying to encourage students from other countries to come to this country, and our students to go abroad. And Jill would know better than I, but quite a number of our students, not the pandemic has created a problem, but a lot of our students do go abroad to study. And one of the key decisions Princeton made back in the early right at the turn of the century, was that it was going to be, it was going to meet the full need of international students, just as it does for domestic students, so that Princeton could admit students from other countries, on the merits without taking financial circumstances into account. And it's now, what, about 12% of the class is foreign?
Yes, 12 to 14.
12 to 14%. Yeah. So, I mean, that's how Princeton's done it. I think it's worked well for Princeton. I don't think the alternative model has worked well for others.
Thank you. Did you have a question? Yes.
Yes.
Here comes your mic.
Thanks, Bob. I was wondering if, after doing your research, finding out new things, or just at looking at everything anew in this process, if you found anything that changed your perspective at all on the university and what that might be.
Well, it's a good question. Again, I'm going to start in a different place and then I'll end up there. I was struck along the way by the number of things I learned I didn't know. So I'd been in Nassau Hall for 47 years. I'd been an undergraduate, and I was a pretty attentive one because I was writing for the Alumni Weekly and I was writing for the Prince. And there were all these things that I didn't know about. So I didn't. Some of them are small, but I didn't realize that President Hibben had proposed a campus center, on the site of where the Oval with Points is now located. Back at a time when I did know that students back in the 1920s were campaigning for office, student government, calling for a campus center. I didn't realize that Hibben and the trustees were actually pretty far along until the Depression derailed them. I didn't know why New South was called New South. And
why is it called New South?
Nassau Hall, at one point in its history, was known as Old North. And when New South was built to try to give it some cachet, which was a challenge, it was named New South to go along with Old North.
Why do you think it is, Bob, that we have this fascination and fixation with old and new? Wasn't there an old new quadrangle and a new quadrangle?
There was an old new quad and a new quad.
Right. What is that?
You probably lived in one, right, John? Well, it's like, take off the Perlman name and call them East and West.
That's right. They come readily to hand.
They come readily to hand. I hadn't realized that there is a woman who in 1942 was hired by the physics department to teach at Princeton, who actually is the first woman faculty member, who's now on a postage stamp. I hadn't known about that. I thought I knew a lot about the history of coeducation and women at Princeton. I was struck. Brian McDonald is here. Brian, at one point vice president for development at the university. I was struck when I was doing the piece on fundraising with how many of the significant donors to Princeton in the 19th century as well as in the 20th century were women. I hadn't appreciated that until I went in and started looking at this. So there were all kinds of things that I discovered along the way that were interesting to me. Do I come away? I come away with a more nuanced understanding of the university, I think, having done this project. Does the institution still look about the same to me as it did before? Yeah, it does. So I don't think there was some moment along the way where I said, "Oh my goodness, I've gotten it wrong all these years." But I think I do have a sort of a deeper appreciation than I did. There are some other disturbing things, right? So I couldn't find this document, so I couldn't include it in the book. But I know I had something in my office at one point. I think it was from the 1960s. It may have been from the 1950s, where a message goes out to alumni, similar to the messages that Dean Heermans was sending earlier, that said, "Don't worry if your son isn't that good academically. That's not really what we're about. We're looking for all-around boys. If your son can talk and chew gum at the same time." It's almost that bad. I couldn't find this. I wish I could. But there are some moments where, I mean, some of what you go back and read, particularly about admission and the way that, students of color, Jewish students, of course, women, for most of history were treated, is disturbing. I knew it was, but I think as I found more evidence of that, it was even more disturbing than it had been before.
Thanks for that. Is there one last question? Yes, please. And here comes the mic.
A follow-up question to the answer about the absence of satellite campuses of the university. Now, you said that many other universities, I think we all know there's some, they had it and they all come to regret it. Why these universities, these other universities? I mean, the way you put it, as if we just locked out, we don't have any. And why these other universities want to have satellite campuses to begin with? What's their common goal which drives them to do that?
Yeah, I don't think we lucked out. I think we made an intentional decision that was different than the decision that others made. And the one I think typical for Princeton, the one we probably knew the most about here was Yale's. And I think they were trying to increase name recognition. And of course, we want name recognition as well around the world. And I think they just found that it was harder to deliver an educational experience in Singapore than they realized it was going to be. And
that's their failure. I'm asking you why they want to do this to begin with.
I think it's about international recognition. I think that I don't want to reveal anything I shouldn't reveal from trustee conversations, but we have trustee conversations all the time about Princeton's international recognition. And one of the arguments that's made for professional schools is that if you have graduates of professional schools, or if you have professional schools, there are more ways for you and your alumni to be known than if you are just a arts and sciences and engineering university, with mostly PhD students and undergraduates. So I think most universities are looking for international recognition. Now, why are they looking for international recognition? Well, partly because you want to attract the very best students from around the world to come to your university, right? Undergraduates and graduate students. You also want, if you're a private university in particular, you want to raise funds, and there were three, leaving aside the Scheide gift to the library, there were three alumni who made gifts of $100 million or more to Princeton, in the 20th century. Gordon Wu from Hong Kong, Gary Anlinger from Europe, and Peter Lewis from Ohio. 3 different countries. All right. But I think part of it is you want to be internationally recognized, and that's why you do this. I want to go back to Marilyn's question and just say one of my other favorite discoveries here, and I think I'd known this before, but I didn't remember it. Was that there was a time from 1943 to 1960 when Princeton engaged an outside provider for Commons, for food service. And that outside provider was Howard Johnson's. See? All the things you don't know. Anyway, I think we have hit our mark here. Let me just say, Bob, there are so many things I didn't know when I read the book. The book is fascinating to leaf through. It's wonderful to read. It gives you a real appreciation for the passage of time after, on a campus like this and how things have grown and changed. Bob, your work has been remarkable. Congratulations for the achievement. I believe he's going to sign books if you would like to purchase your own copy right there in the back of the room.
Any final remarks?
Yes, I just want to thank everybody on behalf of the library for joining us today, both virtually via live stream and in person in the room. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Bob, for being here. It's been such a fascinating conversation. As she said, there are books for purchase in the back that Bob's going to be signing, and I hope everybody gets home safe. The weather's a bit, it seems to be slowing down. So,
thank you for being here. Thank you.
The moderator? Oh, Dana.